The galaxy had long been a simmering cauldron of political tensions, shifting alliances, and wars that flared up like brushfires on the outer rims of civilization. For thousands of cycles, dozens of alien species played the game of empires expanding, retreating, forging treaties only to betray them later. War was normalized, woven into the fabric of galactic diplomacy. But it was a familiar kind of war, fought with fleets, drones, orbital bombardments, and the occasional ground skirmish, civilized in its own way. Then came the great conflict, the war that would eventually touch every system in the known galaxy. It began, as all great wars do, with pride, fear, and miscalculation. The Zarnathi Dominion, a technologically superior species with centuries of conquest behind them, sought to assert dominance over the Virelian Pact. The first strikes were surgical and devastating, wiping out key military installations and commandeering resource-rich planets. Other factions were pulled in, whether they liked it or not, as the galactic web of treaties and trade agreements dragged them into battle. One by one, neutral powers fell, choosing sides or being forced to. The conflict expanded until it encompassed over 70% of the populated galaxy. For a time, the war was balanced. No one could gain a clear advantage. The losses mounted, planets were scorched, moons shattered, populations displaced by the billions, and through it all, humanity remained on the sidelines. Not entirely uninvolved, they offered aid, observed closely, and kept diplomatic channels open. But Earth's fleet stayed home. United under the Terran Accord after centuries of internal conflict, humans had become cautious, hardened by their own near-apocalyptic past. They had learned patience, strategy, and above all, the value of waiting. Other species assumed humanity was weak, too fractured, too emotionally volatile, too late to the party of interstellar politics. The truth was more complicated. Humanity had seen this pattern before, just on a smaller scale. They recognized the signs, and while the galaxy burned, Earth watched and prepared. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and trade, humanity was quietly constructing something the galaxy had never truly understood: warriors. Not ships, not AI fleets, not exotic weapons of mass destruction, but humans trained, honed, and forged into instruments of war so advanced, so utterly alien to the galactic norm, they would be mistaken for monsters. These were not the peacekeepers or fleet captains sent to negotiate or monitor border disputes. These were Marines, the legacy of centuries of warfare, now adapted for the stars. Clad in armor made from exotic materials, enhanced with biotech and neural interfaces, trained in zero, gravity, and radiation zones, they were as much weapon as soldier, and they were kept in reserve. The moment came when humanity could no longer remain silent. A human colony, Farron's Reach, was attacked by Zarnathi raiders looking to cripple Terran infrastructure and send a message to other neutral worlds. The raid turned into a massacre. Civilians were killed, children abducted, cities razed. The footage made its way to Earth. The United Terran Command deliberated for less than a day. They activated Protocol Ragnarok. The galaxy was still under the illusion that humanity would file complaints through the Council, maybe send a fleet or two for show. They didn't expect what came next. No fanfare, no declarations, just the sudden appearance of drop pods falling from orbit like steel meteors. Entire battalions of Terran Marines were deployed without warning, striking Zarnathi strongholds with surgical brutality. It wasn't just retaliation, it was a statement, and the galaxy, so used to controlled, procedural war, had no context for what humanity was about to unleash. The stage was set. The war that had consumed the stars was about to change forever, because the Terran Marines had arrived, and they had brought hell with them. The first planetary drop was on Zarnok 3, a heavily fortified Zarnathi world long believed to be impenetrable. Its defenses were layered, orbital mines, plasma turrets embedded in the crust, and vast underground bunkers connected by a maze of tunnels. For centuries, it had been considered a secure command hub. The Council observers had even wagered that humanity, if it dared strike back, would avoid Zarnok 3 entirely. They were wrong. It became the first target. Without warning, the sky tore open as dozens of black, angular ships entered the atmosphere at impossible speeds. They weren't massive capital ships or slow-moving carriers. These were fast, deployment troop transports, built for atmospheric insertion and high-G maneuvers. From them descended the Terran Marines, hundreds of them in armored exosuits that blurred the line between man and machine. Their helmets glowed red through the storm of entry, like wrathful spirits cast from the sky. When they landed, they didn't march, they charged. The defenders expected a traditional siege, orbital bombardments, protracted space battles, draw, not attrition. What they got was kinetic shock and close quarters annihilation. The Marines moved in units of 5, clearing bunkers and tunnels with terrifying speed. Their weapons fired projectiles that adjusted mid-flight, plasma bursts calibrated for alien physiology, and drones that operated semi-autonomously with lethal precision. The most shocking part wasn't the firepower, it was the coordination, the discipline, the raw aggression. The Zarnathi soldiers, seasoned in galactic warfare, found themselves outmatched at every turn. Their AI-guided turrets were hacked mid-combat. Their escape routes were blocked before they even knew they needed them. Marines operated as if they had rehearsed the battle 1,000 times, knowing every weak point, every fallback, every panic behavior of their enemy. It wasn't war, it was extermination. By the time reinforcements arrived from a nearby moon, Zarnok 3 was already silent. The Terran forces had left, leaving only a crater where the command spire once stood, and a recorded message, "We warned you." The shockwaves spread instantly. Dozens of factions, allies of the Zarnathi, neutral observers. Even their enemies watched the footage in disbelief. In less than a galactic day, an entire military headquarters had been wiped clean. No prisoners, no collateral damage, just clinical, controlled, overwhelming force. The Council demanded answers. Humanity responded with a single phrase that echoed across comms and interstellar feeds. Zarnok 3 was a warning, not a limit. For centuries, ground warfare had been seen as outdated, too costly, too inefficient. Why risk bodies when machines could fight? Why land troops when orbital strikes could cleanse a city? But humans hadn't followed that trend. They had preserved and perfected the art of infantry warfare, combining it with modern tech and ancient grit. They believed in the human element in the chaos and courage of boots on the ground. Their enemies had forgotten what that looked like. Now they remembered, and this was just the beginning. The Marines fanned out across the war-torn systems, hitting Zarnathi supply routes, strongholds, and hidden installations. They moved like shadows, appearing in places deemed unreachable, fighting in environments considered uninhabitable. They adapted instantly to new alien threats. Their tactics evolved in real time. They didn't just fight, they hunted. Entire fleets began to retreat at the mere rumor of Terran Marines nearby. Morale collapsed. The myth of human weakness shattered, and the Council, watching helplessly, began to question whether unleashing humanity into this war had been the greatest mistake in galactic history, because it wasn't humanity's technology that was winning the war. It was the will to fight forged in fire, polished by centuries of struggle, and unleashed through warriors who feared nothing and pitied less. The age of diplomacy was over. The age of Marines had begun. They weren't supposed to last more than a few months. That was the consensus among the Council's top strategists when the war began. Humanity, though technologically competent, lacked the deeps, space infrastructure, the fleet numbers, and the galactic war doctrine refined by species who had fought for millennia. On paper, we were disorganized, scattered, too emotionally reactive. We were seen as stubborn, sure, but ultimately suicidal. What no one anticipated was how we adapted and how quickly we turned the battlefield into a proving ground. In the early phases of the war, after the Marines had made their dramatic entrance, humanity's logistics were under constant pressure. We didn't have the luxury of endless war reserves or fully automated shipyards across a dozen sectors. We were limited, so we evolved. We began integrating alien tech almost immediately, not just copying it, but improving it. Human engineers looked at shielding systems and found ways to miniaturize them. Our programmers dissected Council AI algorithms, turning cold logic into instinctive machine decision making. Every encounter was a lesson. Every skirmish left us smarter, and while the other species believed that doctrine should never change, humans tore up the rulebook daily. Our Marines stopped relying solely on central command and began operating with full tactical autonomy. Units adapted mid-battle based on local intelligence, changing plans in seconds while their enemies were still waiting on Council orders to confirm counterattacks. Where others used protocol, we used initiative. One infamous example was the siege of Veltra's Hollow. The enemy had entrenched themselves deep in a gravity well, expecting a prolonged orbital siege. Instead, a human unit used repurposed mining drones, equipped them with combat AI, and burrowed through the moon's crust, emerging behind enemy lines in just 6 hours. The result wasn't just a rout, it was a massacre. The Council called it dishonorable. We called it smart. Our fleet commanders, too, began to outthink their adversaries. Instead of engaging in massive fleet battles, they employed hit and run tactics inspired by ancient Earth naval warfare. We used decoys, false retreats, and even holographic ghost fleets to confuse enemy sensors. One human admiral once sent out a fake distress signal from a ship rigged to explode with EMP pulses. The enemy took the bait and lost a third of their fleet's ability to maneuver. We didn't just fight harder, we fought weirder. This adaptability extended beyond the battlefield. Back home, our industries shifted overnight to support the war. Civilian companies pivoted to military production. Crowdsourced design improvements went viral, and even entertainment networks started simulating battle scenarios that Marines would later use in the field. It was a total war effort, but it didn't look like anyone else's. While the other species relied on centuries of static planning, we treated every day like the first day of the war. There were mistakes, of course. There were defeats, losses, tragedies, but humans learned from each one. We didn't repeat our failures, and the terrifying part for the enemy was this: every time they beat us, we came back better, stronger. Angrier, the Council began to worry not just about losing territory, but about losing control. Their other client species started adopting human tactics. Some even requested Marine instructors to train their own forces. Fear began to spread, not of our weapons, but of our ideas. War, for us, was not just destruction. It was innovation under fire. In the end, we showed the galaxy something they had forgotten. That war isn't about who has the biggest ships or the most ancient lineage. It's about who can change, who can learn, and who refuses to die easy. Humanity didn't just survive the Galactic War, we reinvented it. The psychological impact of unleashing the Marines went far beyond what even humanity had anticipated. While the rest of the galaxy had armies, fleets, and security forces, they lacked what humanity had perfected over centuries: a warrior ethos fused with a culture of relentless training, improvisation, and emotional resolve. The arrival of the Marines didn't just change the battlefield, it changed the minds of friend and foe alike. The Council's once unshakable confidence in their superiority began to fracture as stories of impossible human victories spread like wildfire across the stars. The first and most profound shift came in how alien species perceived human soldiers. The enemy had expected typical troop formations, predictable, organized, and easy to counter. What they got instead were squads of individuals operating more like myth than military. Marines would vanish into toxic jungles and emerge weeks later having cleared out entire enemy strongholds with nothing but field knives and jury-rigged gear. One unit reportedly survived behind enemy lines for nearly 2 months with zero resupply, using enemy comms to sabotage logistics and spread false orders among the opposing ranks. Alien commanders, once dismissive of what they called Earth ferals, began studying the Marines with increasing fear. Reports flooded Council archives describing unbreakable humans who fought even while injured, who smiled during hopeless engagements, who laughed in the face of annihilation. One admiral recorded that after his forces had vaporized a human landing zone, the next wave arrived within hours, led by a Marine captain who had supposedly died in the blast. It wasn't true, of course, but it didn't matter. The legend was born, and that's where humanity's strength truly began to show, not just in muscle or firepower, but in mythology. The galaxy, steeped in old systems and bureaucratic rigidity, had forgotten the power of narrative. Human soldiers became legends in real time. Entire alien populations began whispering names of Marine fireteams like they were ancient demons. The Howlers of Rigel Prime, the Bastards of Broken Moon, the Woman with the Red Rifle, each tale layered with truth, exaggeration, and terror. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were symbols. This psychological warfare extended even to species that weren't directly involved in the conflict. Neutral planets began refusing Council garrison requests, fearing retaliation from Marines. Even allied species to the Council started limiting their troop support, quietly negotiating with human diplomats behind closed doors. The Marines had become a deterrent greater than any superweapon. The very threat of their deployment was enough to halt planetary rebellions, stop invasions, and redirect entire fleets. It wasn't just the fear of pain or death that unnerved the enemy. It was the unpredictability of humans. The fact that no one, not even humans themselves, could say what they'd do next. Marines would turn battlefields into traps, use enemy corpses as decoys, or march calmly into superior firepower just to throw off a general's strategy. Some even started employing cultural sabotage, broadcasting human music over enemy comms, painting surreal Earth imagery on the sides of captured alien tanks, or dropping leaflets filled with human jokes, confusing propaganda teams who couldn't decipher the psychological impact. The final straw came when the Council attempted to sue for peace by appealing to logic and proportionality. But humanity had reached a psychological threshold of its own. We had no desire to simply stop. The war had changed us too. The Marines didn't fight for territory or treaties. They fought for something deeper, vengeance, pride, and a future on their own terms. So when the enemy asked for a ceasefire, the reply wasn't silence. It was a recording of a Marine platoon singing an old Earth song as they marched into another battle. Not angry, not cruel, just determined, and somehow that was worse, because the galaxy finally understood. They had unleashed something they couldn't put back in the cage. The aftermath of the Marines' deployment left more than just scorched battlefields and fractured alliances. It redrew the galactic map and rewrote the rules of power itself. Where once sat the mighty Galactic Council, bloated with bureaucracy and arrogant in their assumed dominance, now loomed a shadow that stretched across every star system, the shadow of humanity's military legacy. The Marines had not just won the war. They had dismantled the very idea that the Council was untouchable. The first signs of systemic collapse appeared in the weeks after the last major offensive. Council systems that had been occupied by human forces began petitioning Earth's unified command to remain under provisional protection. Not occupation, protection. In truth, many of these planets feared what might happen if the Marines were withdrawn. Not because the Marines threatened them, but because the Marines were the only ones who had stood firm against the chaos and held the line when everything else fell apart. What began as military cleanup quickly morphed into diplomatic power plays. Human diplomats, often former service members themselves, found themselves leading peacekeeping efforts, restructuring entire planetary governments, and being asked to take seats on what was left of the Council. The irony was thick. Those who had once condemned humanity as too aggressive, too chaotic, now begged for our leadership, hoping to copy the same strength that had defeated them. This shift wasn't fueled by brute strength alone. It was the result of cultural momentum. Across alien networks and interstellar media, stories of Marine heroism, sacrifice, and ferocity were shared and amplified. Human military doctrine became a subject of academic obsession in alien universities. Translations of Earth war literature, Starship Troopers, The Art of War, even Marine Corps field manuals, became bestsellers on planets that had never even seen a battlefield. Alien scholars argued passionately about the philosophical roots of human tactical instinct. And sociologists scrambled to explain the uniquely human mix of discipline and defiance. But more than that, humanity had given the galaxy something else, a reason to question everything they thought they knew about war, power, and the nature of sentience. The Council's traditional model of warfare, sterile, strategic, limited, had failed utterly. Against humans, war could not be treated as a distant abstraction. Marines didn't play war. They lived it, breathed it, evolved through it. They made it personal. That realization triggered revolutions on dozens of planets. Entire Council, member species began reassessing their military philosophies. Some broke off entirely, adopting human style tactics and forming new coalitions under Earth's guidance. Others, fearing internal rebellion, tried to suppress any mention of the war, banning human broadcasts and literature, only to find their populations turning to black, mark it Earth content even more fervently. Human influence spread like wildfire, not by conquest, but by reverence and fear. The phrase "send in the Marines" became a galactic idiom used half, jokingly in situations ranging from political unrest to sports rivalries. But underneath the humor was a hard truth. No species wanted to find itself on the wrong side of a fight with humanity again. Meanwhile, Earth had changed too. The Marine Corps had become more than just a branch of the military. It had become a symbol. A reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity didn't just survive, it reshaped the game. Training facilities tripled in number, volunteer enlistment surged, not from a hunger for war, but from a collective pride. Parents once nervous about military careers now bragged about children in uniform. The Corps wasn't just feared, it was honored. And so, in the war's wake, a new balance of power emerged. Not built on technology or territory, but on the knowledge that somewhere, in a dusty training field on Earth or aboard a silent dropship orbiting a distant moon, there were Marines waiting, watching, and no one, not even the stars, dared challenge them again. The final chapter in the saga of the war wasn't written in blood or fire, but in silence. The kind of silence that descends after the storm, heavy with consequence and reflection. When the last Marine dropship returned to Earth, scorched from re-entry and pockmarked by plasma, the war was over. But the galaxy would never return to what it had been before the Marines were unleashed. Victory had come at a cost, but it was absolute. The enemy fleet, once thought invincible, was shattered across 6 systems. Their homeworlds were either occupied, their governments dismantled, or their leaders trialed for atrocities. The coalition that had rallied to destroy Earth no longer existed. Some species were extinct, others were broken, and those who remained spoke of humans in hushed reverence or terrified awe. And yet, as the dust settled, humanity didn't claim territory. They didn't enslave the enemy. What they demanded was something stranger, something far more powerful. Truth. Truth about the war. Truth about the Council's manipulations. Truth about the arrogance that led to the conflict. In open broadcasts transmitted to every known civilization, Earth shared the full unredacted logs of the war, from the initial sabotage attempts against human colonies to the day the first Marine boots hit alien soil. It wasn't just a declaration of victory, it was a message: we are not who you thought we were, we never were. The broadcast ended with a simple phrase spoken by General Area Monroe, the woman who had commanded the Marine deployment and who had become a legend throughout known space. "We are not monsters, but you made us show you what monsters fear." That speech would become the most viewed message in galactic history. It was translated into over 1,400 languages and permanently archived on every major planetary network. Alien poets recited it, rebel groups used it as a manifesto, and entire generations of non-human children were raised on the cautionary tale that was humanity's rise, not as villains, not even as conquerors, but as a force of nature. Earth refused reparations. Instead, they demanded collaboration. Human diplomats, once considered pariahs by the Council, now helped shape new governance structures, emphasizing balance and mutual defense. The Marines, now regarded as interstellar peacekeepers, established training programs for other species. Their goal wasn't dominance, it was deterrence. Make them strong so they'd never be desperate. Make them ready so they'd never be broken. Cultural exchanges flourished. Where once alien leaders scoffed at humanity's chaotic creativity and emotional depth, they now sought it out. Human music filled alien marketplaces. Human literature, with its wild, unpredictable characters and stubborn protagonists, became standard curriculum in schools from the Orion Nebula to the Rimward Belt. And war stories, especially those centered around the Marines, became holy texts in some places. Yet back on Earth, something quieter was happening. The veterans were coming home. Marines, once clad in exosuits, leading charges through stormed bunkers and vacuum-sealed corridors, now walked city streets, hugged their families, and sat in cafes. Some returned whole, others bore scars, mental, physical, and spiritual, and the world embraced them, not with parades or medals, but with understanding. The phrase you served carried more meaning now than it ever had. Museums opened. Memorials were built, not just for the fallen humans, but for the alien lives lost in a war sparked by fear and arrogance. Humanity, despite everything, had retained its soul, and in doing so, had set a new standard for galactic morality, strength tempered by compassion, vengeance reshaped into justice. The Marines' final mission wasn't destruction, it was transformation. They didn't just win a war, they ended an age of ignorance. And as humanity looked toward the stars, now seated at the heart of the new interstellar accord, they did so not as the youngest, weakest species, but as leaders, guardians, and storytellers of a galaxy reborn. The war ended when we unleashed the Marines, but peace began with what came after,